In Revelation chapter 9 and verse 11, Satan is described in this way. It says, "He is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon." Abaddon, literally in Hebrew, means destruction. Apollyon in Greek, the name, remember, that John Bunyan gave to that evil one attacking Christian in his story, Pilgrim's Progress. Apollyon literally means destroyer. Satan is the destroyer. And his intent is to pursue destruction. That is the very nature of the angel of the bottomless pit. He wants to destroy God's kingdom. He is constantly at work seeking to destroy the church of Christ in our day. He has been constantly at work for the last 2,000 years, and he continues this very day. He hopes, he endeavours to destroy local churches like ours. And he seeks to do that in myriad of ways today. He tries fierce persecution in some parts of the world. He uses false doctrine. He tries to drift churches into extremes and all manner of imbalance. He tempts church leaders that they might fall into gross sins and thereby bring great devastation to entire congregations. He tries to lull church members to sleep. He wants Christians to be careless about their soul, careless about the means of grace. He seeks to create tensions between people in churches, between families. He's doing all he can to bring destruction to the Christian church. He wants to destroy the preaching of Christ. He wants to destroy the pure worship of Christ. He wants to destroy the very name of Christ. But Apollyon is not just wanting to destroy the church as a body of God's people. He wants to destroy individuals. He wants to destroy individual Christians. He wants to destroy Christian families. He is roaring about this earth, Peter says, like a lion seeking whom he may devour. Satan wants to take as many as he can with him into the bottomless pit. The fact is, Satan wants to destroy you. That's what he wants. And the passage that lies before us this morning, and God willing next Lord's Day morning, provides an account of Satan's intent to destroy, and yet Jesus' power is too strong. Jesus told that story, some of you may remember it from the Gospels, and he speaks about a strong man in a house, Satan. But then he speaks about someone else who is a stronger man, Jesus, who came to overcome, and as he says in those parables, in that parable recorded in 3 of the Gospels, he came, the stronger man came, not only to overcome, but to bind the strong man. That very parable, I believe, is demonstrated before us in this passage in Mark chapter 9 this morning. The destroyer's work in the life of this boy, here in Mark 9. Well, the destroyer's work in the life of that boy is destroyed by the power and compassion of Christ. We're considering this morning what I've simply entitled The Destroyer Destroyed. Now you remember, it's been a number of weeks I know, but in our previous studies in Mark's Gospel we've seen Jesus and the other 3 closest disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. In our last study together from this part of the Bible, we considered their conversation as they were descending down that mountain. Now we see them. They're coming from that time of euphoria on high. And they're about to encounter the realities of a demonic world. It's a great contrast here. They're coming from the mountain and they're going to the valley. They're coming from the glories of heavenly fellowship and they're going to the destructive darkness of a satanic situation. Look with me then back at this passage from Mark chapter 9 verse 14 as we consider two main things this morning with, I trust, some relevant application through our sermon. Firstly, we'll look at the tragic destruction and then we'll look at the triumphant deliverance. Look with me, firstly then, at the tragic destruction as the passage that we're looking at this morning commences from verse 14. It says, "When he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately, when they saw him," that's Jesus, "all the people were greatly amazed and running to him, greeted him, and he asked the scribes, 'What are you discussing with them?'" So here is Jesus. Remember, it's Peter, James and John who are with Jesus. They're returning from the mountain and they're coming to catch up with the other 9 disciples. And as they come to them, they find them surrounded by this great crowd of people, as Mark describes it. But they also find, Jesus and the 3 also find the Jewish scribes are there. And they're arguing. Most likely arguing with the 9, maybe arguing with some in the crowd as well. But they're arguing. They're disputing. They're in the midst of this debate. And yet once the people notice Jesus coming down from that mountain and toward them wherever they are, once they notice that Jesus is coming, they turn with great excitement and they run to him. Mark says, all the people were greatly amazed. That's the word that sometimes is seen translated in the way that we would often speak today. They were blown out of their minds. Where had the Master been? Oh, how they had needed him. Things had just not been the same without Jesus. And yet when they see him coming, they're blown away in their minds. They're overcome with joy. As Mark describes there in verse 15, they're running to him, they're greeting him. How glad they were to see him again on this day. And we see that Jesus then enters directly into the issue that was of great concern to this crowd. He asked them a simple question. He asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" And notice who it is exactly he asked that. He asked the scribes. You see, Jesus, as immediately as he is there, comes directly to the aid of his disciples. Jesus Christ is the great defender of his people. As soon as he gets to them, he comes to the defense and the aid of his followers then. He is the very one who today aids his people when they are under attack. He is the very one that Paul says in Romans 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It's God who justifies. Who is he who condemns God's people? His answer is, it's Christ who died. And furthermore is also risen, who is even right now, he says, at the right hand of God, who makes intercession for us. Jesus right now is our great defender when we are under attack. Did you notice that in answer to this question that the scribes were asked, the scribes answered not a word? Did you pick that up as we read the passage before? Not one of those scribes answers that question, but rather one steps forward in that crowd, the one who was central to this whole matter that was of a concern before them. Look at verse 17. It says, "Then one of the crowd answered and said, 'Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit.'" And he says at the end of verse 18, this man goes on to say, "I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, cast this mute spirit out, but they could not." Here it seems is actually the root of this whole dispute. that the 9 disciples couldn't cast out this demon from this man's son. And perhaps that was the thing that the scribes noticed. That was the thing that the scribes jumped in on. Here as these disciples, it's a tragic failure to help this man in his chronic need. And these scribes notice that, and they begin perhaps to ridicule the disciples, and maybe even ridicule Jesus, because they are known as the disciples of Jesus. But the matter that I want us to focus in upon this morning is the tragic destruction that Satan intends. What Satan, via this demon, was able to accomplish in this boy's life, in the father's life, and no doubt even with the family. Lord willing, next week we'll come back to this passage. We'll pick up some other matters in this passage. But for the moment, look with me how Mark describes this tragic destruction. Firstly, we have a distraught father. Look again at verse 17. Try and hear his words and feel the pathos of this man, this father, as he comes and he says, steps forward from that crowd. Jesus asks this question. Here's this man, and all of the urgency and burden of the situation comes forward, and he says, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." Now let's try and imagine what this father has been going through. On this day, he perhaps sees this great crowd gathering. He's heard what Jesus has done with other demon-possessed people, no doubt. He's heard perhaps what Jesus has even done with other children. His words here in verse 17, "I brought you my son." But when he gets to the crowd, the one that he went looking for, the one that he brought his son to, was not there. Imagine that. As a father, as one burdened, he thinks Jesus is there. His hopes are raised. And when he saw the crowd, he thinks Jesus must be there. Look at all the people. And Jesus is not there. His hopes are dashed. And then he hears that Jesus has gone away, perhaps with the 3 disciples, and they've been overnight somewhere up a hill. But then he notices the other 9 disciples are there. And maybe it was that he had heard the report that had been circulating throughout all the land that Jesus' disciples had recently been on a ministry trip throughout all the land. And we've studied this previously. They'd healed the sick. He'd heard that. He'd also heard that they'd cast out demons. And maybe his hopes began to rise again when he sees those other 9 disciples, when he sees Matthew, when he sees Thomas. He takes his case to the 9 remaining disciples. And again we find those words in the end of verse 18. "I spoke to your disciples." This element of hope that they should cast it out. But they could not. His hopes were dashed. Once more they were shattered. Here is a distraught father. We know that he was distraught for how he approached Jesus. Matthew tells us in his account that he knelt down before Jesus and he said, "Lord, have mercy on my son." He assumes the posture of a beggar. He gets down at Jesus' feet and he begs for mercy. He's a distraught father. Imagine the agony this family went through with his son. Imagine the deep struggle that went on inside this father's heart. Every time they see this son doing what he does, when the demon comes upon him, "That's my boy. My boy." A distraught father. And yet, of course, he's not really the central focus here, at least what we look at this morning. We see, secondly, a desperate boy. Yes, there's a distraught father, but the reason there's a distraught father is because there is a desperate boy. And the first thing we must say is that the cause of this boy's desperate state was due to demon possession. Mark makes it very plain that this lad had a demon. In verse 25, when Jesus addresses this situation, it says very clearly, he rebuked the unclean spirit, the foul spirit, the evil spirit. Now, friends, we shouldn't conclude from this. It would be wrong for us to conclude from this that everyone who suffers from fits or some sort of convulsion, that is a result of demon possession. Some people have made that conclusion. That type of conclusion is far too simplistic. The Bible has other things to say. Due to the fall of man, there are all manner of physiological problems with the human body. And many in our world today who suffer from convulsions or fits and the like are suffering the consequence of sin being present in God's world. Not necessarily due directly at all to some demonic activity in that person's life. We must make that point. However, coming back to the story, the case that lies before us here in this passage, the root cause was here that the tragic destruction that was happening because of this demon. The Father in verse 17 describes this demon in an interesting way there, and he calls him a mute spirit. It seems to suggest that the demon had this effect upon the boy, that the boy was unable to speak. He was mute. Now, we perhaps don't regularly use that term in reference to speaking, but we do hear about mute somewhat in our modern electronical world. Don't we, children? You know about the mute button on the remote control. You hit the mute button and it turns the sound off. There's no more voices coming from the television. There's no more noises coming from the television. If that's the item that you're turning off, or it's the stereo, you hit the mute button, it stops the sound. Well, this man was mute, this boy rather was mute as a result of the spirit. He could not speak, or maybe even not even have noises that could come from his mouth. Further than that, we know about him in verse 25. Jesus addresses the demon not just as a mute spirit, not just as a dumb spirit. Notice what he says. He says, deaf and dumb spirit. So it seems that the lad was also unable to hear, as well as not able to speak or make any noise. You think of this boy. This poor boy was shut up in a world of soundless existence. What a frustrating world that must have been for this boy. What frustration for the father in trying to communicate. What frustration for the mother. What frustration for the family, for the boy. And yet, who's behind all this confusion and frustration? Satan. As we come to verse 18, we see that he had physical and no doubt emotional torture. It says, and whenever it seizes him, he throws him down, he foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid. Notice carefully how this man describes what happens to his son. He says, wherever it seizes him. In other words, it's unpredictable. Wherever, it could happen anywhere. It could happen when we're in the markets, at the shop. It could happen at home. It could happen in the synagogue. Wherever. That demon would throw the boy down to the ground. The same word in the New Testament to speak of wineskins torn apart is what's used here. It's a powerful image that's being used here, that the demon would throw the boy down to the ground with great vehemence, and it's like he's being torn apart. Luke 9:39 tells us that the demon would bruise him. He would throw him down, perhaps suggesting his young body was left with bruises. Mark goes on to tell us in verse 18 that the demon would throw this boy into convulsions. He foams at the mouth. He gnashes his teeth. He becomes rigid. But that's not all. Look at verse 22. It says, and often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. His young body not only covered in bruises, no doubt he had scars from the many times that demon had thrown his body down right next to a fire, burning his flesh. The demon had the intent to destroy. That's what verse 22 says. It says, throw him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. The demon hoped to be burning his body alive. That's what he wanted. Other times the demon would be throwing him into water with the intent, no doubt, to drown him. What a desperate boy. And friends, we must see this, particularly as it's said here in verse 22. This was not some accident. The boy didn't just be like a boy sometimes and be a bit careless, and he stumbles and he trips and he falls into the water or he falls into the fire. No. The demon threw him into the water and into the fire. The demon had a deliberate and, it says often in verse 22, he had this repeated intention that he wanted destruction for this boy. That's what we're told by the Father, throwing him into the water to destroy him. Jesus asked the Father that question in verse 21. How long has this been happening to him? Again, Jesus doesn't ask the question because he didn't know. Jesus knew that already. He asked the question to inquire, to draw the Father out. And the answer is, well, ever since my boy was a little child. We can't be precise when it comes to the ages that's been spoken of here, but we can at least say this, that for years this has happened. Since he was a little child, now he is a boy or a lad, he is a youth, he has not yet reached adulthood. So it's for years that this had happened. Now we need to understand what that's telling us. That's telling us that Satan does not give up. You see, Satan and his wicked demons have this intent still today. They want to destroy. You remember Jesus' own words in John chapter 8. They describe Satan. He says he was a murderer from the beginning. That's what he has always been since he fell from that place in which he was created upright. He is still a murderer today. And friends, I want us to notice this morning that this passage gives us a vivid and a realistic demonstration of the true hatred and the destructive intention of the devil. Satan is the destroyer. Apollyon, that's his name. Satan wants destruction, and he doesn't care one bit what he does to people. There's not one bit of tenderness evident by this evil spirit toward this boy in this passage. Not one bit of regret that he had a body maybe covered in bruises and scars. Satan and all of his demons are totally insensitive. Satan doesn't care that the boy is thrown down to the ground. He doesn't care that he's bruised and foaming at the mouth. He doesn't care that he's burnt and drowned. He doesn't care. Satan wants utter destruction of the image of God in this boy. And Satan wants to take him into hell forever. Satan doesn't care that this boy is probably not even a teenager yet. That doesn't stop him. Satan doesn't say, I'll wait. I'll just wait a little bit more till this boy grows up before I'll try and destroy him. And he certainly doesn't say, sorry, I didn't know you were born into a good Jewish family. I'll leave you alone. No, this passage gives us a vivid and realistic view of the true hatred and the destructive intention of the devil. You young people need to listen to this morning. Satan wants to destroy you. He wants to take you into hell forever. That's what he wants. He wants to have you with him in the bottomless pit forever. That's what he wants. And that's his intention with you. He doesn't care that you're just a young boy. He doesn't care that you're just a young girl. He doesn't care that you have Christian parents. He's out to destroy you. He's a murderer. And he's been that since the beginning, and he wants to murder your soul. That's what he wants. Dear children and young people, I'm not trying to scare you this morning, but I am trying to warn you. I want you to listen very carefully. I don't believe there is anyone here this morning that is demon-possessed. But I do think there are some here who are demon or devil controlled. You see, everyone in this building not united to Jesus Christ by faith, you are under Satan's control. Now you may say, I'm not. I do what I want. Well, your conclusions are different to God's, and God knows. Please turn with me in your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 2 and listen to what God says about people who are not yet Christians. Ephesians chapter 2, Paul is talking to Christians and describing what they were like before they became Christians. And he says in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. That's, he says, how you once walked before you were a Christian. Look at it again. You once walked according to the course of this world. Now notice, according to the prince of the power of the air. That's Satan. The spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. Now don't hear me incorrectly. I am not saying that the only reason that you would choose to do what you would do in terms of sin is because only of Satan. That's part of what's said here. It's not all that's what's said. Verse 2 and 3 must be read together. If you are not yet a Christian, the Bible says here that you are under the sway of Satan, but you are also doing what your evil and carnal desires want you to do. And that's what you actually want to do. 2 Timothy 2:26 says, you are ensnared by the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. Now we must recognize that the devil is smart. He doesn't normally do today as he did to this lad in Mark chapter 9. He may do that in some cultures, in some parts of our world, but he doesn't usually do that in our culture and in our situation. He's smart. He's usually far more subtle in our time, in our culture, and especially people like us. But his purpose in end is the same. He wants to destroy you. He wants you to experience everlasting destruction. This boy is in a desperate state. And I would put it to you that some of you are in a desperate state today. The fact that some of you don't even realise that you are in a desperate state highlights how desperate your state is. And one of the things that made this boy's state so desperate, that there was no one on that day who could help him. No one. There was no one that could help him, and there's no one that could help you except Jesus Christ. The boy couldn't help himself. The family members couldn't help him. The father couldn't help him. The disciples of Jesus obviously couldn't help him. Only Jesus. You see, it wasn't religion that the boy needed. It wasn't a bit of counselling that was needed by this lad, or even by yourself. It's Christ that's needed. He is the all-sufficient one. In Him, all the resource we need for every issue in our lives. To go elsewhere is in effect to say, Jesus, you don't have all that I need. Think with me, secondly, in the passage as the story moves forward, we look at the triumphant deliverance. The triumphant deliverance. Notice what Jesus says at the end of verse 19. After He asks those questions, and we'll come back to those questions, God willing, next week, but right at the end of verse 19 He says, bring him to me. Bring the lad to me, Jesus says. I want us to hear those words. Think about those words. Bring him to me. We're starting to think about the triumphant deliverance. And Jesus' word is, bring him to me. You see, there's the answer. There's the answer already. You must go to Christ. There's the answer for us as Christian parents. This is what we must do for our children. Just like this father, bring our children to Jesus in prayer. There is nothing too strong for Jesus. Remember that parable I made mention of earlier. Jesus is the stronger man. Yes, Satan is a strong man. But Jesus is the stronger man. The disciples had fault here because they failed to pray. Jesus says, bring him to me. Jesus' words surely speak to us as disciples of Christ this morning, concerns that we might have for other people. It speaks to us as ordinary Christians. It speaks to us as parents. Literally, we can bring our children who perhaps may some of them still be under Satan's influence. We can bring them to where Jesus meets his disciples, which is what he was doing here. And it's what he does here. We can bring them to him, bring them to those places and those times when he is present in power, ministering his gospel. Or hear the words of Jesus to all Christians who are burdened over a lost soul or some troubled one another. Bring her to me, Jesus would say. Bring him to me. Coming back to the story, when the child is brought to Jesus, you notice how the demon responds. This is very enlightening. The demon responds in agitation. Verse 20. Then they brought him, that's the lad with the demon, to him, that is to Jesus. And when he, that is the demon within the lad, and it's hard to decipher exactly here, but when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. This word wallowed is only used once in the New Testament, and it's this spot. It's the picture of a pig turning over and over and over in the mud, wallowing in the mud. But this is not a pig, this is a boy. Think of it, dads. as your son. Think of it, Mum, as your son. What a horrible picture for this poor child, foaming at the mouth. It's such a distressing scene. The demon is agitated as he comes near Jesus, as Jesus comes near him. Some of you know that passage in Revelation 12. It gives us a glimpse into why the devil and why the demons are so violent and angry in this world now. I quote you the verse, Revelation 12 and verse 12. It says, "The devil has come down to you, having great wrath." He's really angry. Why? Because he knows that he has a short time. It seems to me that the whole demonic world was agitated and it was moved to greater and more intensified activity during the ministry of Christ, because they knew that the stronger man was present to overcome them and to bind them. And here, even just in this story, we see the picture the same. This demon, his anger increases because he knows that he only has now a short time in this lad. The demon faces defeat. And Mark records for us more of the words the Father said in the second half of verse 22. He says, "But if," speaking to Jesus, "if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Hear him? He's desperate. He's in a distraught situation. He's pleading for Christ's compassion. He's pleading for Christ's help. We pick up the story from verse 25. It says, when Jesus saw that the people came running together, so there's a heightened interest now by the crowd, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became, the boy, as one dead. So that many said, "He's dead." After one last spiteful act, the demon obeys the voice of Jesus. And everyone's watching. The crowd's just increased. The rest of those people just ran in there. And everyone thinks he's lying motionless. He's dead. You almost hear the whisper through the crowd. "I think he's dead. He's dead. He's dead. He's dead." Verse 27. But, the reality is, but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up. And he arose. It's a beautiful touch in Luke's account. It says that after that happened, Jesus gave the lad back to the father. Beautiful touch. And yet, can you not see here what a triumphant deliverance this is? He who had been under the control of this demon is now given back into the Father's care. The Son had come. There's agitation in the demonic world. He overcomes in deliverance. And the one that he has delivered, he gives into the Father's care. Oh, this passage is rich. The very one whom they thought was dead, Jesus takes by his hand, he lifts up, and notice what's said there. And he arose. That's the same word for resurrection. It's actually the same word that Mark uses back in verse 9 that he goes on to use in verse 31, describing what would happen to Jesus after his death, that he'd rise again. I don't think that's a coincidence. No. You see, the lad wasn't dead. It's like a dramatic thing unfolding before him. It's a dramatized thing in front of this crowd. He who appeared as dead is not dead. Look, he's now alive. That's exactly what the power of Christ can do for any sinner. Triumphant deliverance. We read before in Ephesians 2. We read verse 2 and verse 3. But Paul had already described in verse 1 what it was like for those people before they were converted. You know the words, he says, you. Yes, you. He made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. Here in this passage we have the triumphant power of Christ. When it comes to this lad, the destroyer is destroyed. In terms of his effect and influence over his life. You remember those words of Martin Luther, that hymn? Though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. What do we have in this passage? A word from Christ. The destroyer destroyed. I believe this passage is very helpful for us. This story shows us Mark 1 verse 1, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You see, Jesus' actions in this story point forward. Have you seen that already? They point forward to the time when Jesus will conquer all the powers of darkness. And how would he do that? He would do that via his death and his triumphant resurrection. All of those that the Father gave to the Son, that the Son gave his life for, he would save them. He would snatch them from the grip, from the power of Satan. He'd rescue them from destruction. And he'd give them to the Father's care. And yet it came at a cost. You think of all the hellish fury that was poured out in the events that relate to Christ's suffering and crucifixion. Their agitation was heightened in the garden when Judas stepped forward and he kissed with that betrayer. A kiss. What deceit. What a devilish act. Jesus, remember the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane when in the process of being betrayed and handed over to his enemies, Jesus turns to his enemies and he says in the garden, "This is your hour." And he says, "The power of darkness." Think how the demons stirred up the violence and the cruelty in the carnal hearts of those soldiers and the Jewish leaders. And perhaps just when Satan and his demons thought they had Jesus destroyed, in the act of his death, Christ won the great victory. Colossians 2 says when he was nailed to the cross, verse 15, he disarmed principalities and powers. It's not something he's going to do in the future. He did it on the cross. It says he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. At the cross, the destroyer was destroyed. Again, Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14 says, through death, that is, through the death of Christ, he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, who is this? The devil, and release those who through fear of death were all the lifetime subject to bondage. Why did Jesus come to this earth? John tells us in 1 John 3 verse 8, for this is the purpose, that the Son of God was manifest, that he might destroy the works of the devil. I put it to Apollyon, the destroyer is bound today. The strong man entered the house, He wrestled him, he overcame him, and he bound him. Through his death, Jesus Christ disarmed Satan, he who had the power of death. It's through his death that Jesus releases all those who place their trust in him from bondage. Jesus died. And just when everyone thought Jesus was dead, lying motionless in the tomb floor, and the whispers went around the crowds in Jerusalem of all the people who had come there for the Passover feast. He's dead, he's dead, he's dead, he's dead. Jesus burst forth in resurrection power his triumphant deliverance. We know, friends, there's a day coming when this same Jesus will command the demons again. He will command the devil and all of his fallen angels, and he will say to them, "Begone, go into that bottom pit," and he will say, "Come out no more." And everyone who has not come to Christ will join them forever. Those of you still under the sway of Satan, even you children, Jesus is the one who can set you free. He and he alone has the power over Satan. You can't break yourself free. Jesus is the victor. His death, his triumphant resurrection is proof that he is Lord, and he is the one alone who can save you and set you free. We would urge you as Christians here this morning, we would surely, would not we all, brethren? We would urge you, come to Jesus. Come to him today. Wait no longer. What are you waiting for? Whoever you are, come to Jesus. He has the power to deliver you from the bondage to your sin and the captivity you are currently in to Satan. Christian friends, see again the triumphant deliverance here in this passage. Satan, it's pictured for us of what would happen at Calvary. Satan is the defeated foe. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word will fell him. Yes, he's our enemy, but Christ, the all-powerful Christ, is our victor. He's our Lord, and he's our Master. And he can deliver us from whatever snares and whatever temptations the evil one puts in front of us. Greater is he who is in us than he who is in the world. Let's pray.